Hello, everyone. Welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons, a philosophy podcast about big topics and bite-sized pieces. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a graduate student in education at Liberty University, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of philosophy and English at Genesee Community College. Today, we'll be talking about free will, the ability each individual has to make decisions for themselves. While this topic seems fairly straightforward, I have to warn you it can quickly become nuanced and mind-boggling. The good news is, if you decide the conversation isn't for you, you can choose to turn the podcast off at any point. Or maybe you can't make that decision. Maybe if you take the action of turning off the podcast, that action has already been determined for you by the past. In order to figure out if you're capable of making your own choices, you're better off listening in so you have all the information before you make your decision. Or at least you think you make it. Okay, so as the intro shows, free will is a bit of a complicated topic. We'll start out with the aspect of it that everybody's most familiar with and is really still to this day the biggest, debate in free will, which is the positions, determinism versus indeterminism. Can you kind of outline the two camps there?
Yeah, so ultimate determinism goes back to the Big Bang. It says that from the moment the universe emerged, cause and effect, there's the causal analysis, if you could do it back that far, would say that every cause has led to an effect, that led to another cause, that led to an effect, that ended up with me deciding to drive to your house today, to your home, and to do this. That it was all determined by pre-made decisions that themselves were determined by all the way back to when I was a child. And didn't know that I was going to be interested in philosophy, but somehow a whole series of events led to that. Okay. And then there's a variety of that called physicalism, which you and I were talking about before we started recording, which is that neurological activity actually determines what we do. So physicalism is part of determinism.
So it's kind of like that same argument, but in a nutshell. So as opposed to the Big Bang, you're going to have some kind of electrical impulse that leads to some other, synapses and neurons firing in this part of the brain and then this, and it's a cascading effect into action.
Yes. So your physical being itself biologically determines. And then indeterminism, which is just a sort of a different word for free will, says I'm an autonomous being. I have agency, which means that I can take actions regardless of what is taking place around me. That I don't have to, there's nothing that says that I have to be, those actions are already made for me. And because I might look at something that's happening saying, nope, I'm going to do this. I'm going to turn left instead of right because I just decided to turn left, even though everything wanted me to turn right.
Okay. So I think most people who are going to be out there listening are going to think, oh, well, that's what I believe in. I believe in indeterminism because I am inside my brain and I'm thinking and I'm deciding I'm going to look left and I do, and it happens. So I had a choice to do that. Whereas this determinism stuff sounds really far-fetched. Like, oh, okay, so you're telling me that every single thing that's happening relied on all these other things happening before it. It seems wildly improbable that you'd set up you'd build this giant house of cards and then they would all fall just so. But
and yet, if one thinks about it, why do we make? I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, not jumping the shark, but jumping. Why do we make a decision? You invited me very kindly to do this a year ago. It took me a year to get into a place to be able to do it. But I wanted to. And the wanting to kept approaching me until we finally made it happen. Was it going to happen because you kindly asserted and I wanted to, and therefore we made it happen? Or did events in our lives take us closer and closer to the point where we could actually make this happen? I think going back to the Big Bang thing, yeah, probably I get, that seems almost absurd, and I'm totally with the idea of the Big Bang. So, but But the idea that events shape us and interact with us and tend us toward things, takes us to a middle ground. The middle ground is called compatibilism.
Right. Yeah. And that's where we're going to head to next is compatibilism. And this is something that I'm still kind of shaky on, doing the research for this episode, because there's different shades of compatibilism. And, sometimes they refer to it as soft determinism and this sort of thing. And I'm like, okay, well, this seems to make sense some. And then you read the criticisms of compatibilism and you're like, well, no, I'm not sure. And so I think that might help too. If we went over the criticisms of the different viewpoints, if you want to explain compatibilism first, we can do that. But then I think we should go back and say what the criticisms of each theory are.
Right. We should. And I want to hear what you've been finding. So compatibilism at its most simplistic is the middle ground between the two things. So essentially it says, it's just in a sketched way. Some things are determined. Some things are open to us to make choices. So let's take an example. We've talked about religion before. So, and I think it's very viable to do that in the sense of the story that everyone knows. We don't have to go into esoteric stories. So the Adam and Eve story. All right. So God creates the heavens and the earth and creates this utopian garden and creates man and woman and says, the only thing you mustn't do is eat from this tree. Eat the fruit from this tree, which is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or the tree of knowledge. All right. And so we know how the story plays out, but did Eve, it's always the female in mythology and folklore and sacred text. Did she choose to eat from the tree of knowledge, or was she predetermined to do so in order that everything else could happen in the creation of God? If Eve hadn't done that, if Adam and Eve had stayed in the garden, there would never have been need for Jesus Christ down the line. There would never have been need for a new covenant. There would never have been all of that story.
Yeah, you could even say there wouldn't even be a need for the human race, because I think that the initial purpose for the creation of Adam and Eve was essentially so God could have some company.
Well, yeah, okay. So and yeah.
So it's an interesting story, because you had the angels, you have all of these beings, and what separates the human creation from the angels is that the humans have free will. So the entire biblical story and the story of humankind within a biblical context comes down to the notion of free will.
So yeah, right. So you want to so God lets you have the capacity to make the right decision or the wrong decision. That's compatibilism in the sense that now I'm going to back away and I'm not going to be insulting anybody, because we know I've done this disclaimer before and I mean it. It's not deriding a story. But if we just even back away further, if you have a being who knows everything, omniscience, can know past, future, and everything in between, and St. Anselm and many others found all kinds of ways to say that, well, yeah, God is outside of time, or God is inside of time, and all those kind of things, but there's still the idea of omniscience. So if God is aware of everything that happens, past, present, future, then there is some kind of deterministic element to all of that. But if we get to make a decision that somehow changes that, then God already knows the changes that have happened. So that the outside of time determinism exists, while the inside of time free will exists, and there's that compatibilism again.
So you've jumped ahead again. So now we're halfway through the podcast and we haven't hit the 10-minute mark. No, we'll go back and we'll hit everything. But I think that this is an extremely good thread, and this is where I wanted to take us eventually. Is that idea of religion and what the philosophical implications of religion, with free will and religion. See, omniscience and predestination in philosophy and these sort of things. Because, like we were just saying, if the entire framework of the religion is based off of the idea of free will, what does the idea of an omniscient God, how does that play in? And is it, so like you said, is the idea of an omniscient free God and humans with free will, is that an example of compatibilism, or is that a contradiction? Can you actually not have it?
Often it's an interesting question, because often I think it's unavoidable to recognize the contradiction. But whether you're people who believe and it's not theoretical, or people who take it as theoretical or possible, if such a being exists, we can't know what it's like to be such a being, because we do not have omniscience. We can talk about omniscience in the abstract, but we don't. However, I would say that, and we had a chat a while ago about being a parent and now a grandparent. There is a very strange thing that happens as a parent, and I can't speak for all parents because I'm not omniscient, but where there's a dilation or a conflation, a compression all at once of time. So that when I see my adult child who's out in the world plying his craft honorably, and his wife who's doing the same thing, but when I see them, especially him, but her, because I've known her for a long time, when I see them, there's this hall of mirrors kind of strange special effect thing where I see all kinds of stages of his development every time I look at him. It's as if now it's not like psychedelic, you're seeing all of these, it's not that strange. But yet, all the moments, you can't remember all the moments, just select ones, just pop in, you see them, even as you're having a conversation. And so there's a kind of seeing a cause and effect of where your adult child came from and what might have led to what. And you don't know it, but you speculate about these things. What did I do there that might have led to this? But then, of course, you're not responsible for everything that happens, because many outside factors happens too. Well, okay, so let's go back to God for a minute. God creates everything. The deists, as we've talked about before, said that God created everything, like the machine, the clock, set it into motion, then went on to do other interesting things. Stood back. Okay. So in any machine, and machines well, and whether it's musical instruments or sound creating devices, a machine will do things you didn't expect. There are glitches. There are surprises. Why did that happen? Even if we made the machine. Okay, well, that's where I think the compatibilism happens. If you make a mechanism, you know all the pieces of the mechanism. You have constructed it bottom to top and set it in motion. And if it can still do things you didn't expect, then there's some kind of opening for surprise. And that's what I would call the compatibilistic free will. I'm not a high-end scholar on this, so I'm just talking, in primitive fashion. But to me, that's the space that opens up.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting description, and that's definitely something I can relate with. Right before we started the show, I went to try to record, and I had this strange pause, and then I stopped it, and it hadn't recorded the couple seconds that we had just done. And I mean, I didn't build the computer, but I did assemble it myself, and it's worked, correctly in every other instance. But here we are on the 2,346th time I've tried to record something, and it did something strange, and I can't explain why it did it, So, and I'm sure that there are laws and theories that govern how the computer works, and that say, okay, well, if this happens, then this should happen. And if we send an electrical signal from the motherboard to here, to this, to that, the other thing, then he should be able to record. But for whatever reason, that didn't happen in this case. And it not happening didn't break the whole computer and everything's over. But it not happening led to an unpredicted outcome, and I think that is a good way of looking at it. It's not those theories, and equations don't work out perfectly every single time. But at the same time, it's not like I'm always experiencing something different every time I turn on the computer.
Right. So oddly, mathematically, the idea of probability is floating around in this discussion. Would you say that some things in our life we are so ingrained by our parents that stays there no matter what, even if we wrestle with it?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so I might, without even thinking about it, react to a certain situation in a certain way because my parents taught me to do that by their own behaviors for the entire time I grew up with them. Now, that was a long time ago, but I still have my dad, and I for a long time had my mom, and I know that I would still think in my head, I wonder what they think. I wonder what they think about what I do. Which means, and I think most of us do that. Even if it's an unfortunately negative kind of circumstance with families of, well, I don't want to do that because my dad did that. I'm grateful that I'm not in that situation. But yet there are some things our parents do we don't want to do. But you see, then we're just deciding based on what they did. So
it's an interesting thing because I feel like very rarely are there neutral feelings towards one's upbringing. I feel like I had a great upbringing. My parents are awesome. And in most cases, I'm trying to emulate who they are as people. But there's only two categories. There's that 98% of things where I'm like, man, I'd really like to be like my mom and dad. And there's that 2% where it's like, you know what? No matter what, I'm not going to do anything that they did, But whichever way you slice it, you're right. They're having an influence on how I'm living now. And as a result, how my future is determined to some extent.
Yes, and there's the compatibilism.
Yeah, so it's not completely determined, but I am taking that large section of my past and integrating a big chunk of it into how I'm living now and into the future. So that's awesome. I think that of everything that I've read, I think this discussion we had right now was the clearest idea of compatibilism that I've had. So so I hope that helps people out as well. Let's revisit determinism and indeterminism real quick and talk about what do people say, what would be the arguments against determinism and indeterminism?
All right, so we've talked about a lot of different people, and I'm not going to just toss names out right, left, and center, but let's think about Plato for a moment. Plato and the ideals, the forms. Okay, so if there's an ideal guitar in the universe, and every guitar that's actually iterated in physical terms is a flawed version of that. We can recognize it as guitar, but not capital G, the guitar. So the determinism would be that perfection exists and we keep trying to reach for it, that we must reach for it. This Aristotle, after Plato, the Nicomachean Ethics, when he was writing essentially of ethics for his son, is saying that we naturally tend toward the good. We sometimes stray, but it's just human nature to want to do good. And if we're not doing good, it's because we just don't understand the situation enough. It was very ideal in some ways. If we would just be able to understand the situation, well, of course we'd do the right thing because that's what humans would do. It's beautiful, and it's what we, but I think most of us in the 21st century would say, no.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I was actually thinking about this exact thing, and what's funny about it is I didn't think it would pop up in this podcast. I was just thinking about it as I was shoveling the driveway this morning. But all of a sudden it popped in my head, you think of Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, or Bob Ross, or Mother Teresa, or whoever, pick your, And what you'll find is everybody loves these people. Find me one person that doesn't love Mr. Rogers, But how many people are trying to live like Mr. Rogers lived, you know? Even if I look at, myself, and I feel like without being boastful, I'm somebody who does try to, become a better version of myself constantly and does try to do good things. I still don't find myself anywhere near trying to emulate the kind of behavior that I admire so much. I do these other things. And if you look at, like you were saying, 21st century society as a whole, I don't think that we do see that. So the question is so maybe back in Plato's time, society was more, more idealistic or self-improving.
But I'm going to slide this in just to make sure we don't try to give the wrong impression. Sure, everybody who was of the dominant elite, educated, wealthy political culture, which is to say a fairly small number of people who could go to who could study with Plato or work with Socrates. Okay. But then slaves, women, the poor, they're not part of that game.
And so this brings up something that just got me thinking. So Plato's thinking that there's the capital G, or the idealism in the sky that everybody is gradually working towards, but I think that looking at modern scientific discoveries and the way that society reflects it now, you'd almost see it the other way around. Rather than something that's out there that's perfect that you're working towards, people more look back at something that was worse but is being improved upon. In other words, biological or evolutionary determinism. We have these things built into our genes through thousands or millions of years of evolution and bioprogramming. And as a result, we're trying to break out of them to become more idealistic creatures.
Or take control, or attempt to take control of evolutionary forces. So evolution is blind. So it runs into walls, dead ends. We know these things. But then we have transhumanism, and we've talked about that before. Well, there's the compatibilism, I think, happening again. We exercise the free will, we think, to try to improve ourselves because we are developing the capacities to improve ourselves perhaps faster or differently than evolutionary forces. Now, determinists would probably say something like, the evolutionary force is what ended up having your mind become the way it is so you could develop these tools. And therefore, it was inevitable that sooner or later you're going to develop tools that are going to be able to affect things on a planetary scale. So, you think you have free will, but no, the free will said, I'm making these special prosthetics. I'm making cybernetics. No evolutionary force caused that. How do you know that? And then the compatibilists would say, okay, yes, so evolution has led us to this moment, but what we do with this moment is perhaps up to us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that now we're starting to get a little bit into that quagmire that is really great and engaging about the free will argument, which is where almost, like I said at the beginning, everybody I think identifies with the indeterminist viewpoint when they start talking about free will, because it just seems natural to think I'm making decisions. But really the determinist, determinist sort of viewpoint says, whatever decision you're making, there was all of these things that led up to you making that decision. So you didn't make a decision. You're just acting. You're just playing your part in the.
And you think that you have it. You take it from a sociological viewpoint. You immerse somebody in a culture. We all are immersed in a culture of some kind, a society with rules, regulations, definitions of what is normal, definitions of what is not. And those, thankfully, change, but they change through social evolutionary forces. Nonetheless, think about people who say contradictorily or behave that way. Just say, everyone's an individual, but you better be like us. Right? Okay. It's sort of like the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer special where the Hermie the Elf and Rudolph team up with, let's be independent together. So we claim we want individuality, but we want everyone to toe the line on this is what America is supposed to be, as an example, or to choose your country. Well, no. If you are growing healthy, to be patriotic is to question, but not for everyone. For a lot of people, to be patriotic is to do the exact opposite. Well, if you're doing the exact opposite, then you're being governed by the forces that have already been set in motion. You're not thinking about them. You're just going along with what's always been, except it wasn't always.
Yeah. So I think what we've established over the past 10 minutes or so is that determinism can take many different forms, whether you're looking at it from a metaphysical level, the Big Bang happened and all these things happen, or an evolutionary perspective. Well, humankind took this course, which is still within the it all fall within the metaphysical sort of, frame. But so you have the evolutionary aspect, the social evolutionary aspect of human interaction. And so you have all of these things, and a political, all of these things have forces. So, but that almost seems contradictory as well. So if all of that can be explained by the metaphysical sort of framework, then that should be it. The Big Bang, because the Big Bang happened the way it happened, now
we are the way we are.
Now we hate gay people. But
thankfully not all of us do, because we have wrestled with that.
Right. But so if we look at it objectively, though, we can see, well, no, because there's evolutionary differences, there's social differences, there's political differences, but all of those things still fall within that metaphysical thing. So it's almost this weird, like you were saying, I think when you talked about, seeing your kids grow up and your grandkids and things, it's that same thing where eventually, if you live long enough, everybody has that experience where you reflect on something. And like you said, the time dilation and the stretching and compacting, all of these things. And you realize, to you, it seems like nothing has changed. You seem exactly the same, but you've seen somebody be born and grow up and do this and do that. And it all seems like it happened at that moment, but also over the course of a long period. And it's that same sort of thing. It's like this freeze frame where, just the whole thing, you can see, well, it seems like this caused this and this and this, but it's all within the idea of this one timeline, which actually isn't time, it's space, and they're one thing. And it is it one moment or is it 13 billion years? Who knows? But it's really a strange thing. So what is the argument against that? It seems like such a, we started out at the beginning saying it's free will. I make choices. And now we've gotten to a point in the conversation where it seems like, no, it's impossible to make choices. Everything is already set in stone. So what are the arguments that say, no, it's not set in stone?
At the risk of making you sigh, I think we should work at it from the point of a what if or a scenario. So because I'm a certain age, because I'm 61, I have, since I was 50, interestingly, living in the Western New York culture, not everyone's the same, and thankfully that's the case, but there are social expectations. Many, many, many people make a big deal out of turning 50. And one takes pause and says, why? And then there are parties where people have, they wear black to mourn, and people give them ridiculous presents that celebrates the coming of age, bedpans and silly things like this, and sometimes walkers, and to joke about age, but somehow at the same time to say, you ought to be thinking about this now. And one says, why? And then you turn 60, and then people start to say to you, are you going to retire soon? Are you thinking about retirement? why? And you start looking at the social determinism, which says, well, at this point, this is supposed to happen. At this point, you're supposed to feel X. At that point, you're supposed to feel Y. If you are part of the culture, this is what you do. This is just part of the process. And I'm here saying, why? So I think there's the free will aspect. I'm not denying that I'm 61 or somebody's denying that they're 50 or anything like that, but there's no compelling reason, at least to me, to say, well, because I've reached that age, I must act thus. Nonetheless, a lot of people, for all kinds of reasons, either cave to that or more necessarily feel that. People have worked really, really hard at an intense physical labor without being able to take care of themselves, or don't have the capacity to have the medical care that they ought to have. Age in different ways. Genetics determines some of what's going to happen to us from the viewpoint of illness. That's a determinism. That's a physicalism. But even so, if you look at someone like Thich Nhat Hanh, marvelous Buddhist, major philosopher, who in ancient age still says, no, you don't have to do it this way. It's possible to be beyond your body. It's possible to not be governed entirely by your physical self. That's, I think, maybe one of the most profoundly important aspects of free will. You can choose to change your mood.
So, yeah, that makes sense to a lot of people. And I'm sure that, determinism is going to stick with that argument. Well, because you chose to do this thing, it has something to do with your past. But I think that when you really get to that sort of stubborn level, you can start to rely on science to vanquish a little bit of it. There's been studies done with twins who were separated at birth, who share all this stuff, and you can see, okay, well, yes, they had a lot of similarities, even not being together, but they did do different things. They did do these things. Or twins, who did stay together and did different things, So these people that share the exact same DNA. So up until the point of their birth, they're essentially the exact same person. They're carbon copies. It'd be like if I built another copy of this computer and we ran them at the same time, they're not going to have a glitch at the same time, or they're not going to operate exactly the same way.
I wish you would, I don't know if you can, but we were talking about an interesting story from your own experience before we started.
Okay.
Which I think is an excellent illustration of exercising free will when training, the determinism of training based on past practice was overridden by a judgment call.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So when I was doing some training for the Army, we had an exercise, and, we're doing a combat exercise. We're running around. Everybody's, shooting and whatnot. And there's, you get trained to do certain things in certain instances. And it's not like the movies would have you believe, because in the movies, the action hero is always ready for every single circumstance that presents itself. I'll tell you right now, that's not the way the Army trains. The Army teaches you a very small number of skills, but then they ingrain them in you so that anytime those situations pop up, you're ready to do that thing that they taught you. Improv is not a huge part of military training. So we're doing this combat thing, but the counter to that is the fog of war, this idea of if you have a lot of distance or a lot of explosions or a lot of adrenaline, if you have all of this extraneous load happening, it's really a fight between all of those external distractions or internal distractions and that training that has been attempted to be ingrained in you. And if that training is not working, then the entire thing falls apart, because this guy over here is relying on you to do something. That guy over there is relying on you to do something. And if you don't do it, then it's like dominoes. The whole thing falls apart. So we're doing this training exercise. The whole thing falls apart. So the sergeant calls it off, pulls us all in, and, yells at us for a long time about all the things we did wrong. But then, we do some push-ups. And after that, tells us a story about, being in Afghanistan and how, as a young soldier, like at the stage, and he was at the stage in his career that we were at that point. He was in charge of a checkpoint in Afghanistan on a bridge. And, the orders were to not let anybody pass. And they had a standard operating procedure of what sort of actions he was supposed to take if somebody did approach the bridge. So as he's standing there, a car comes driving towards the bridge at a high speed. So he has, a glow stick or a flashlight or something. I don't quite remember, but he starts waving it over his head, and that's his first step to tell them to stop. And the car doesn't stop, and it doesn't even slow down. It continues driving. So his next option is to fire off his rifle in the air. So he fires off, 3 shots in the air to get the driver's attention. Still, there's no reaction. Comes driving at the same speed, same everything. So he goes to the next step, which is to shoot in front of the car. So he shoots off a few shots in front of the car to let the driver know, don't come any further. The car continues to drive. The next step for him was to eliminate the driver, to stop the vehicle from moving any further. So there's been policies written, standards established, things put in place to say, this is what you need to do as a next step. And regardless of whether it's a 5-year-old kid driving the car or whatever it is, you are exempt from any consequences because you followed the actions that were put in place to make you responsible. But he said he wasn't sure why, but he just knew that this driver didn't have an ill intent. So he didn't shoot him. He held off, and the driver pulled up to him, and it was just some Afghan dude, and they were speaking a different language, and he had no idea what was going on. And the sergeant, told him to turn around and drive away, and he did. And that's the end of it. Very anticlimactic, But in that moment, it's a showdown, because this guy who's driving, his life is on the verge of ending because he's making decisions that he's unaware of. But the sergeant's life is also at risk of ending if he's making the wrong judgment about what kind of person this guy is.
And you see how all of what we've been talking about is a marvelous story and built into it. So the driver was making decisions he doesn't know he was making. Well, that's either physicalism, neurological determinism, or socially trained because of the milieu, the environment, the place. If guns are going off all the time and buildings are in collapse, and so it's normal to have soldiers walking around firing and people shooting guns, and that's normalcy, then what tells you to stop? I mean, if your training has been socially, experientially, this happens all the time, then where's the warning message? Whereas for us, the light over the head, the light stick flashing and the gun shooting in front of the car and so on would seem to be wake up,
right.
But that's us. And I'm grateful to say many of us were not in that situation growing up in those ways. So that was a different kind of normalcy. The lead actor in this story that you just told had sounds like to me exercised extraordinary free will. On the surface of it, he bucked his training, or he used his training to say, nope, making a judgment call. But if that judgment call was so fast, he didn't even know why he made it. If he couldn't honestly articulate why he knew that this was, or thought he knew, there's epistemology, why he intuited that this was not an enemy.
Yeah, because that's part of the story that I told the first time. I forgot the second time. That's important, was when he called us all in and told us this story. He stopped after he said he shot in front of the car, and he said the next step is to shoot the driver. What would you do in that situation? You've already had 2 more seconds to think about it than I did, And so, yeah, it's in that case, making a decision is a different thing in one sort of environment than in the other,
And was he bound to make that decision because of the way that he grew up, because of his genes, because of his training, because of his whatever intelligence, his social, emotional intelligence, all of that cluster of things? Did that require that he make that decision? I would say probably not. I think that's where the electricity jumps from the synapse across the gap.
Yeah, if you look at the whole background of the situation, and I won't go into it a whole lot, but, his upbringing, his background, the entire military institution and how often they encourage free will, how often in a combat zone with firmly concrete written SOP, they encourage free will in that scenario. I think you're exactly right that making a decision to go against that's one of the most unlikely places to find free will, based off of all of those factors.
You're making a decision to eat a piece of fruit because you want knowledge.
Yeah.
That's an extraordinarily, because there's this being that going back to the story, this being that made you, brought you into existence. Okay, well, we can get away from Adam and Eve again, just go to parents. Parents say, don't do this, don't do that. Here are the rules of and whatever. However, and still, children will, of course, say, maybe I will. Maybe I'll try it, right? Okay. And because if they didn't, would they be beings that we would even recognize?
Yeah, you're just kind of robots at that point. So, all right. So I think that was really great. We established some sort of argument against just hard determinism. But I think that the question that arises from that is now going the other way. Is indeterminism even possible, or is it all compatibilism?
To me, if you're asking me personally, one person having messily thought about this, I think compatibilism is probably the most compelling zone. And it would be easy for somebody to say, well, yeah, that's the gray area, that's the in-between, but so many things are.
Yeah.
Because I can't righteously say that even on Maslow's, if you think of Maslow's hierarchy, and you certainly are in your studies know this. So the self-actualized person, we know that we aren't all self-actualized all the time. If we were, we'd be a completely different social creature. Maybe we'll get there, but we aren't. We have really low moments. We crawl around in the mud. We do stupid things. And how many times do we say, I don't even know why I did that? There's a key towards some deterministic element. I don't know where that came from. Well, if somebody studied you from a distance for a while, from a duck blind, they could probably point out to you, well, you did this happened. And so there is some determinism, but no, we don't act out of an autonomous total agency all the time, because we acquiesce freely, but we think. So, we always tell stories of, no matter what workplace we're in, we narrate about our heroic adventures at the workplace and how we stood up to the boss and this, that, and the other thing. Well, that's human too. It's good over a beer, but and sometimes we do those things, but not nearly as often as we like to think we do. Because if we were that way all the time, there wouldn't be an institution. Institutions are built whether the army or a college or whatever, to have acquiescence toward a set of established and agreed upon, in one way or other, agreed upon principles. You sign on, you contractually say, I will sign on for this because I can accept these principles. But built within the principles are options to make decisions based on your training. I hire you as a teacher. I hire you as a teacher with this amount, this experience, and these qualifications and these degrees in mastery and so on, to put you in a classroom with a group of people, knowing that you're going to apply your craft, and I will trust that you're going to apply your craft as best you can, unless somebody tells me that they're not. But that implies a set of autonomous decisions constantly that themselves arise out of some more deterministic training. And that's what you were describing with the army situation, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, just because I have no doubt that there's some people who started this podcast that, like I've said it several times now, would be staunchly free will, just intuitively. And now we've gotten to a point in conversation where, for all intents and purposes, it looks like pure indeterminism, pure free will just isn't a possibility. There always is going to be things that determine, if not a specific behavior, things that determine a pattern of behavior or a tendency to think a certain way or to lean towards a certain way. Not to say that you can't go against that tendency or you can't do these things, but you're fighting upriver is what it is, It's like, I think of my stupid cats. You have cats and sheep. One of them's really good for herding and the other one's not so much. Each type of individual is going to have tendencies, and then how they act on those tendencies are, some of it is up to environment or genetics or these other things, and some of it might be up to them making actual.
Yeah, here, kitty. I love my cat, but I don't think I would love my cat nearly as much if my cat behaved the way my dog used to. And I loved my dog. But if I say to my cat, come on off my lap, the dog would have been there instantly. The cat looks away, looks around, wiggles his ears. And that's the charm, right? Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he's probably the person that most, whose work has stymied people for centuries, still does, because he seemed to say in his work, just very, very briefly, at the first part of his work was, and people have read and misread and tried to understand and I don't begin to understand him entirely either, but the early part of the work seemed to indicate that to be truly free was to be, to go back to being the most natural being that you could be, free of rules, free of. Immediately after that, he writes about the social contract. And in Rousseau's ideal world, in the social contract, you cede not just to obeying rules, you give up your very self to a highly rigidified, Christian-oriented, dominated culture. You do not make decisions. I'm oversimplifying, but it's essentially, and what Rousseau seemed to say in his letters and and in his later writings is, to him there was no contradiction. Everybody looking at this say, "What? A natural person?" And he said, "No, because to give yourself utterly to a culture, to a societal institution, is to then be totally free, because you have all of the potential differences between you and everyone else has been evaporated. You're absolutely equal because none of you has anything." So free will is to give up free will so you can be free.
I mean, it's a mind-bending stuff. But, at the same time, looking at it on an individual level, okay, well, to this guy, based off of his genetics, his social upbringing, his situation, that is a choice to have that sort of thought that doesn't really make sense to the rest of us. So let's talk about, is mind-body duality something that plays into this at all?
Yes. I'm nodding. It's on a TV. Yes. My body. because of the physicalism aspect, because people who say, just starting with Descartes, but all the way up through, if there is a ghost in the machine, if there's something that's totally insubstantial, unmeasurable, a soul, whatever, you cannot prove any causality that insubstantial, unmeasurable, unseeable thing has caused X, Y, or Z. You can talk about soul all you want, and it's fascinating. And we say, well, but there is a soul. How do we know? Because somebody told us. Okay, but that doesn't hold all that much water. But I intuit it. I feel it. I just know it. Epistemologically, that doesn't hold much water either. But okay, but we still accept that sometimes. How does my soul make me do what I do? What are the mechanics? Even if they're metaphysical mechanics. If you take 3 seconds or 2 minutes and you look at that and you have to, I think if you are a humble enough rational being, you'll have to say, well, okay, yeah, this is pretty flimsy. I still believe it, but why? So mind-body duality, when there's total separation of the two things, would indicate that we are accepting that something that cannot possibly be seen, measured, or experienced in any shareable way is governing things, which is what leads to the neurocognitivists saying.
Yeah, that's what I was just about to segue into was, knowledge of free will, science, neurology and psychology findings, and what they say about mind-body duality, what they say about determinism, indeterminism, and that sort of thing. And it seems to be, science like to think that it leans towards determinism, and because of these studies that they've done with, the advanced technology we have now, fMRI and EEG and all these things, they can look at things and say, okay, well, you're about to say a certain thing or make a decision, but milliseconds before you do it, I can look at your brain activity and see that you're about to do that. I was mentioning a study to you before we started. That's brand new, where they were able to look at people's brains using EEG and look at the different waves and tell by how the waves lined up if somebody is going to give a good or bad performance on something. And it didn't matter what the performance was, whether it was playing a musical piece or assembling a mechanical object or whatever it was. They could tell based on the brainwaves and the organization of the brainwaves whether the individual is going to be successful in that performance or unsuccessful. Now, scientists tend to look at that as determinism. Okay, well, despite your intent, you have an intent and a will, and this reminds me of the Schopenhauer quote, but you have an intent and a will to do something. You can picture in your mind's eye playing the Star-Spangled Banner like Jimi Hendrix on guitar. But then when you actually put your fingers and pick to the strings, that's not what comes out. And so it's determined. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but that's essentially where science is at right now, is they see that as determinism. And I'm not, something about that doesn't quite sit right with me, but I didn't know if there's any philosophical framework behind it to say, well,
there is, but it would start to some extent by asking the question, why doesn't it sit well with us? Because that's really where Daniel Dennett and a number of the neurocognitive philosophers would go. Well, of course it doesn't sit well with you because you want to believe that you have free will. Okay, that's first. Second, why else might it not sit well with somebody?
I think it's that the physicality argument. I think that you'd like to think that the generation or the origin point of a thought has, I have some sense of control over that. I'm not just, hey, we're doing a podcast now, and then after you leave, if I play guitar, it's not because we talked about guitar in this podcast. It's because I had a new thought saying I would like to play guitar now. And I think that's the sticking point.
And so you had a new thought. Now, whether that new thought, see, I think what really bothers people, the philosophers now would say, if we're being honest with ourselves, what really bothers us is to think that new thought, which could be argued be a free, I chose to do this. Okay. But if it all comes from the physical being, that's the really hard sticking point for people who say, no, there are things beyond this physical self. There must be things beyond this physical self, or I want there to be things beyond this physical self, or any combination of that kind of response. And I get that. I mean, every one of us, I think, at some moment or other has this longing toward immortality. We have this longing toward, it's got to be something more than 70 or 80 or 90 years. This vast universe, really? That's it? That just seems unkind. That seems, or that seems absurd. But if we put that aside, and the neurocognitivists try to get us to put that aside, to see that for what it is, and say, well, of course we all long for this, but really, does it diminish us in the least that we learn to play guitar because our body, our chemical processes are leading us to that? Do we still not create wonderful things? We create artwork as you have done. I go out to my study. Sometimes I walk away from the computer. I go out to my study. I sit down, and today's the day that I'm going to make this piece of art. Now, I've been thinking about it for a while, but suddenly there it is. This is the moment. I do it. Was that determined? If it was, it's so subtle to me, I can't imagine why in the chaotic life that I live. At some point, I say I need a different change of pace, so I'm going to go do that. But putting my hands onto the pastels, onto the paper, however egregiously awfully, but it feels wonderful. I do it. But did it have to happen at that moment? I don't think so.
Yeah, and I think that kind of this, what it comes back to is I know how to play guitar, and that is somewhere in this 3 pounds of meat that's up in my head, but I'm not a diesel mechanic, so I can't, although I can have that thought of, I'm going to play guitar now and do it, and think of that as being a free choice. I can't have the thought of, you know what, I'm going to tear apart and reassemble a transmission and then just go out and do it, because that's not up here yet. It can be, I can learn to do it, but that having that origin thought versus being able to go and accomplish something is different. And I think that's what the science is saying. The science is just getting down to, you can have these thoughts, but the execution is different. And so, and again, that brings in the mind-body duality thing. My brain, or, I can picture something happening and yet not execute it here. And that brings, that comes back to our sense of self and all our knowledge and everything we think of.
It does, because we still don't know what consciousness is. We can take pictures. We can take snapshots. But that's akin to taking a snapshot of this blob above a swamp and saying, I don't know what it is. It must be a UFO because I saw it. I know I did. And well, you saw something. Your brain's making of it what it wants to, your imagination. But so, yeah, it doesn't, the consciousness and the self, whatever that is, and we've talked about that before, we don't know what that is yet.
Yeah. And that's what the final question is today is, I was asking, does consciousness create the illusion of free will? Is that, and I mean, that's what our conversation is culminated with.
That's what the Dennett's of the world would say. Yeah.
Yeah. The first thing I thought was people consciously find incompatibilism logically intuitive. So in order to avoid fatalism, they naturally assume free will. And I think that's what we've been talking about the whole episode, is essentially you hear about determinism of any kind, whether it's physical or the cosmic or whatever. And you want to fight against that because, like you were just saying, if you just accept that, then you're just a cog in the machine, and you're a very, very small cog. You're just an 80-year-long cog that might work 9 to 5 and never really, nothing happens, quote unquote. But I think that that's where the perspective and looking at, what's important in life, it really comes in, and how you make meaning of things. But I think that is a big part of that. The other thing is, consciousness itself seems to be antithetical to determinism. Humans can look into nature and make accurate predictions based on past events, but even with accurate prior data, human behavior can't be entirely accounted for. And that comes down to predictability versus predetermination, I think. And I think that's the key thing that we've struggled with this whole kind of conversation is predictability versus predetermination. At what point does being able to say somebody's going to do something mean that somebody is going to do something? And I think of sociology in this a lot. Like you look at like the bystander effect. If you see somebody getting murdered, you're more likely to jump in and do something if you're by yourself, as opposed to if there's a group there. Because if there's a group, you're going to automatically think somebody else is going to jump in. Somebody else is calling the cops. Somebody else is taking action, so I don't have to. This is a observed scientific phenomenon. They've replicated the studies over and over and over again, and it always happens that exact way. The more people you have, the less likely it is to take action. But the less likely doesn't mean somebody isn't going to.
That's true. But the argument, the scientific argument about that, and this goes to the singularity, artificial intelligence, algorithmic, geometric progressions of algorithms. The argument is that if you just have enough data, then you will know. And what tickles me about that is to say, oh yeah, so as soon as we get omniscience, we'll know.
So if I've turned this computer on for 4 years and it just had a glitch today, if I were to turn the computer on for the rest of eternity and find out, oh, it glitches once every so many times, I'd be able to do that.
What would it be like, do you suppose? Now, this is going to seem like a question of apostasy or heretical proportions. So Joel's not a part of this. This is just me. But what would it or must it be like if you know that you have created a universe, if you know that you created beings who are going to say, nope, not doing what you said. And if you know that because of that, you're going to destroy your creation. And then if you say, I already know that I'm going to destroy it, but I also know that I'm going to rebuild it. We can't inhabit that space because that accommodates every possibility.
Yeah. It's something that I can imagine a 2-year-old doing in make-believe, but not in all powerful.
Because as a parent, because of seeing other parents, because of having been a child, you know that a child is going to say no, is going to do something.
Or a child going to play and say, I'm going to build this tower knowing I'm going to knock it down, or I'm going to have these pretend people, and I know that this guy's going to disobey and this guy's going to do this thing, but then this guy's going to win. You have that pre-thought out.
But if I have a child and is disobeyed, and then they have a whole bunch of friends and all of them are disobeying except a couple, what would society say of me if I said, I'm just going to kill all of them and start over again?
Yeah, free will. It's funny because
that would be heinous. That would be, you lock me up in another dimension.
Yeah. No, it's funny because I think that this has really been an eye-opening episode, because even though I planned it, it really went into a lot of places that I couldn't imagine. And I think that the most recent place is ethics, like free will and how it relates ethically to religion or society or these other things is a huge question.
Free will is built into virtue ethics, probably more than other elements of ethics, in the sense of your ethics are based on who you are, your characteristics. The idea of free will, compatibilism, those things are built into that, because does that mean who you are is going to determine how you make an ethical choice? if, deontology, when you're talking about from the soldiers, the duty. I have a duty to wave the stick, fire some shots in front of a vehicle, and then if not, kill the driver. Whether I'm released from that because my duty is to follow those codes. And yet something arises and says, nope, not this time. So the free will absolutely exists, but probably in the compatibilistic sphere.
Wow. Man, that was a cool conversation. And I'm sure, I've no doubt that in future conversations, this is going to pop up and we'll reflect on it more, especially when we're talking about consciousness and ethics. So thank you for listening to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. Recording and production are provided by me, Joel Bouchard, and the song featured in the show is Questions off my album Jaguars, which you can find on Spotify or anywhere MP3s are sold. Until next time, keep pondering.